I am very excited for today's webinar. Some of you may know my research has been looking into the hoof-horse connection, so this is going to give us a whole new outlook on that. And of course, I've got Maren Deal with us today, who the author of the book Bite Integrity Beyond Biomechanics. She'll tell us a bit about that at the end. But we're going to go ahead and get started. So, to give a little bit of background as to how this kind of conversation came about. So, my research is looking into the link between hind hoof morphology in particular and pathologies along the dorsal myofascial line, which you can see here. So the red and green line is the dorsal myofascial line. And I've been looking at the three-way relationship there seems to be between hoof balance, static posture. So I've been mainly looking at static posture, and pathologies following these myofascial lines. So that's what my research has been looking into, is the link between hoof morphology, static posture, and pathology along this dorsal myofascial line. So there's been a few studies now looking at the link between poor hind hoof conformation and higher pathologies. So here are some of them. Here we had, first of all, in 2007, Sue Dyson suggested that there was a link between poor hind hoof balance and proximal suspensory desmitis. And then after that, 2010, Mansman linked poor hind hoof balance with gluteal region pain. And then after that, we had Pezzanite et al. 2018, who linked hock arthritis with negative plantar angles. And then Clements et al. 2019 linked stifle pathology. And then Wormsley et al. 2019, subchondral injury of the third metatarsals. And of course, if we look at these places, they all kind of line up along that dorsal myofascial line. So, which led me to do further studies on that line. Now, some of you may have seen the webinar I did with Dr. Gelman, where she outlined the influences on static posture created by domestication. So she highlighted important areas of proprioceptive input and how these areas being dysfunctional directly affected the horse's static posture. And so the main areas that she outlines in her webinar, and people can obviously go and buy that webinar and watch it, is dental issues, TMJ issues, upper cervical issues, and of course hoof balance, and how all of these created changes in static posture, which we can see in the lower picture, and they call, the studies of Gelman and Shoemaker call it abnormal compensatory posture. Now, of course, again, this is looking at statics. Now, in my own research as well, which I kind of have to only briefly outline because I'm still waiting for it to be published, and I'm also going to be presenting it properly at the Rood and Riddle conference in April, so I can't go into it in too much depth. But with this other research I've just mentioned in mind, I tried to uncover some more relationships. And I found that how camped under the horse was directly correlated with how poor its hoof balance was. But I also found that improving the hoof balance improved the posture. But again, this is static posture. Now, very interestingly, I found that there was no significant change in hock angle with improvement of the posture, even though there was a direct link between hoof balance and the metatarsal angle. So this suggested that the change in posture was coming from somewhere much higher up. So I was looking at pelvic inclination and those kind of things, and I'm sure that it is coming from there as well. So but in my mind, of course, there must be an important junction up there somewhere, and my future research intends to quantify that. And obviously, Maren is going to suggest one of those junctions. So my research established a link between hoof balance and posture and higher dysfunctions, but the question still remained. What was causing the posture, and why is it so ubiquitous in the domestic horse population? Of course, the studies of Dr. Gelman and the discussions that we had there suggest those different things affecting static posture. But then I started to have to chat with Maren about this subject. Again, my research very much focused on static posture and the position that the horse adopts for 22 hours of the day when it's not moving. But as Maren is going to talk to us about, there's perhaps dynamic postures going on, being created by certain things that are kind of exacerbating and cementing into place this static posture that they continue having for the rest of the time. So this is where I hopefully have set the kind of stage as to why I started having this conversation with Maren, and then I will allow Maren to take over and talk to us about her theories. So, Maren, would you like to take over?
I'm very happy to be here today, and you did some of my introduction already, but I think I will start again. Because it was really the start for this conversation and for this webinar that Yogi said, okay, I found in my research that negative plantar angles were associated with a non-vertical metatarsal. My hypothesis is that this posture is the link between the hind hoof morphology and the associated higher pathologies. And the question is, what is the cause of this adopted posture in domestic horses? And my answer was the dysfunctional lumbosacral joint. Sure. And that's a very short answer for a very complex topic. And so we will discuss this in detail now, and I will try to answer that question created by Yogi's study. Yes, that's the funny part. I'm not a native English speaker, so if there are longer pauses and strange terms, don't mind. And if you want to ask questions, please keep the questions short and in simple words, even when they are about complex topics. Yes, I can. So, what is the cause for the non-vertical cannon bones in the posture of so many horses? And no, the hoof trimming usually is not the cause, as well as it can't be the solution in itself. The hoof trimming is one piece in the bigger picture we will look at now. The dysfunctional lumbosacral joint is the cause. If we make it work properly again, most problems will vanish. And I often get the answer, but there are so many factors in that, the body is so complex you can't know. Okay, I will try to be louder. Is it better now? I hope so.
I can hear you perfectly, so don't worry about the
Okay.
So I think it must be, yeah.
Okay, I will try to do.
Ignore the chat for now, because
okay.
we can they can
Okay.
listen to the recording if they need to.
Okay. So there are so many factors in that, and the body is so complex you can't know. That is right, but you will see on the next slide. what I found during the last years is that the complexity of the horse's body is well organized and includes key functions, of which the use of the lumbosacral joint is the most important for a saddle horse. And many of the other key functions and that exist in a horse don't work when this key function is disabled in a way. So we'll have a look at the anatomy of the lumbosacral joint and the skeleton of the horse. We'll answer the question, where is it and what are the components and connections and how does it work? What moves in which direction and how does this affect other body parts? What you see here is a Shetty spine, 30-year-old Shetty stallion. If you try to find the lumbosacral joint on this picture, you can only guess. You can't see it, and that's the same in most anatomy graphics. We will have a closer look at that. This is the lumbosacral joint. It is what I call the functionally closed lumbosacral joint, and you still can't see it because it is closed. It looks like just vertebrae in the spine. The lumbosacral joint is between sacral bone and lumbar spine. This is the open lumbosacral joint. It has a range of up to 20 degrees. And note the ground distance between the processus spinosi. You can feel and sometimes see that gap in a living horse. And maybe, Yogi, you can switch between these two slides. So, yes, forward and back and forward and back so we can see. Yes, that's very nice. So you actually can see it when it moves, and when it is static you don't realize what's going on. Okay, let's go on. What you see here, that orange part, is the joint surface of the iliosacral joint, which connects the sacral bone with the pelvis. And I experienced that the findings in the iliosacral region are caused by a dysfunctional lumbosacral joint. So most of the horses have findings in this area, and people try to work on this area, but the iliosacral joint can't open in the way the lumbosacral joint does. It is just a sliding of flat joint surfaces between pelvis and sacral bone. And what makes the direction of the pelvis is the lumbosacral joint and the angle of the sacral bone. The pelvis and the sacral bone always move together. The sacroiliac joint has a very small range of motion. It works more like a shock absorber than a joint. And as soon as the lumbosacral joint opens, the sacral joint and the pelvis move into a steeper angle, and the lumbar spine slacks. And here we can switch again between the two pictures, so you see what happens in the horse. So it's not only the pelvis that seems to be steeper, it is also the lumbar spine that falls down. And that position of the pelvis with open lumbosacral joint leads to misalignment not only in the hind but in the whole body. It also affects the force transmission from the hind into the center of mass and all force directions in the horse in a dramatic way. it is sort of a complete phase change. And the non-vertical cannon bone in a standing horse and the shortened second half of the stance phase in trot are only two out of many changes caused by a dysfunctional open lumbosacral joint. What you see here is the lumbar spine again, and you will see in the pictures we show later that all these horses have a very big belly, and it's not that too much food, it's just the posture. So this webinar is supposed to be about posture and hooves, and we have to look at functions and force directions because form follows function. And we need some physics too, and I promise it won't be too bad. And it might be helpful to do some own sketches now or later when you review it. The stance phases. The following pictures will give you an idea of the stance phase, and the anatomy behind the sketches I'll use later. So what defines the stance phase? There are different points of view, and when it comes to functions, I try to show the ideal which matches most breeding standards and old military assessments criteria. And however, here we will find some triangles. Every stance phase begins with the first ground contact and ends with the foot leaving the ground, no matter how and when the maximum load is reached. So that's the definition of a stance phase. The timing of the point of maximum load during the stance phase is different in different motion patterns. So we have the load and we have the triangle and we have a timing. And the pictures will show and explain that too. The stance phases of each foot should be more or less the same in every gait. It is the coordination that is different. That's my observation. You see here the anatomically not quite correct stance phase of the hind. The angles in the middle of the stance phase are wrong, but the picture will do the trick in general. This is the triangle of the stance phase of the hind we will work with in the following slide. Then we will have a look at the triangles without bones. You see, you have a first half and a second half of a stance phase. And this is roughly the triangle of the foreleg, with the center of rotation somewhere in the shoulder blade. And all angles change obviously in motion patterns with dysfunctional use of the lumbosacral joint. And that would be another topic for a PhD paper, how the center of rotation moves in different motion patterns. So my observation is that it comes down along the shoulder blade in motion patterns with dysfunctional use of the lumbosacral joint, but I can't prove it and I have no numbers. The triangles, always be aware of what you can see in the graphics and what is hidden. The joints and tendons would be like vectors which sum up to one line in the triangle at one point in the timeline of the motion pattern. The alignment of the bones changes in each moment when the body is in motion, so it's not the same anyway. And you can see from what direction the distributed ground reaction force hits the joint or takes its way through the leg. And again, these triangles don't show the anatomy. They show force directions and the timing in motion. Because if these lines were the legs, you had straight legs and that doesn't work in a triangle because the line in the middle is shorter than the others. Okay. The symmetric triangles symbolize the spatial and temporal uniformity of movement, and they change shape and position depending on the individual motion patterns. The triangles consist of two phases. During the first half, the structures of the hind get loaded, that's what's colored in orange. Horse is moving to the right. And in the second half, they unload and distribute the ground reaction forces into the center of mass, if the lumbosacral joint is in a functional state and the horse knows how to use it. So that's how it should be. The foreleg, including shoulder and trunk carrying structures, keeps the distance to the ground. And there is a stretch towards the ground before the foot touches the ground, and the active part is the first half of the stance phase. And in the second half, which is more passive, the work is already done. In positive motion patterns, there is no load on the toe when footing off. That's a very important point, that in footing off there is no load on the toe. The leg pulls the foot from the ground. This picture shows the result of a good coordination and force management in a saddle horse. So the legs don't show the position of the legs in reality, they show the force direction. And another important thing is you will not find this in studies about wild horses, because wild horses don't need that. They don't have to carry a rider, they don't have to use their abilities like that. Okay, the lumbosacral joint. The next slides explain how the use of the lumbosacral joint changes the position of the triangles and the force directions. The last chapter was about the triangles in a good mount with the functional use of the lumbosacral joint. And see now what happens as soon as the lumbosacral joint opens. This is the hind with symmetric triangles, active second phase, and a functional lumbosacral joint. And I think you can imagine how the propulsion takes its way through the horse. The red arrow points to the open lumbosacral joint, which is further up than the green one because the pelvis is steeper than before. And what you have seen in the first pictures from Yogi, when the lumbosacral joint is open, the hind legs don't bend, they are very straight. And so this change in position must affect the hip joint and all the other joints. The triangle follows the pelvis. So the range of the legs belong to the position of the pelvis, and that's why the triangle follows the pelvis. And this affects the size of the first and second half of the stance phase, because when the triangle moves and we still have the ground in the same place, see next slide, we see that the first half becomes larger, and the second one smaller. The propulsion can't pass the dysfunctional lumbosacral joint anyway. So that's the motion pattern we get. Here we see the stick horse. The first half of the hind stance phase becomes active in braking, while the forehand pulls the horse forwards. So these force directions changed. What should be the forward power of the hind goes to the front, and the controlling force of the forehand transforms to be a braking force in the hind. That's what happens when the lumbosacral joint opens. Remember this picture of a horse carrying his rider with functional use of the lumbosacral joint for force distribution and a foreleg keeping distance to the ground. And maybe we can switch between these two pictures as well. Oh, that's the wrong one. I think we'll make the the next one too. Yes, this is the result of a dysfunctional use of the lumbosacral joint with a rider on the horse's back. And now if you switch now, you can see the change not only in the horse, you can see what happens to the rider, and maybe you recognize some riders in these different pictures. Okay. And probably you've already drawn your conclusions. This change in force directions must change the function and form of the hooves. So you see on the right side, when the triangle changes its position on the ground, there must be a change in form and function. Okay. The hooves. Here we are back to Yogi's study. The following stick figures may help you to explain the findings to others. To horse owners who try to do the right thing but got it wrong, and to vets and therapists who know how to treat the symptoms but not the main reason of the problem, and of course trainers and saddlers. So the picture above, you can see the usual form, and on the lower right you see the form of hooves we see nowadays everywhere. The green legs stand for the force directions, so don't mind them at the moment. The blue ones belong to the standing horse, or for the diagonal legs in trot in the middle of the stance phase. And that's where the main load is. And so we have this form of the feet. And next slide. As soon as the lumbosacral joint is open under load, the force directions change, and so do the triangles. Next. As soon as the lumbosacral joint is open under load, the legs are no longer vertical when they should be, so they are not vertical at the same time in trot, and they are not vertical in a standing horse. And the hooves adapt to this situation. So here you can compare the two different pictures of what makes the form of the hoof. Okay, next. As soon as you start teaching a horse to collect via opening the lumbosacral joint, the toe angle of the hind hooves get smaller, as you can see here, and other reasons for the open lumbosacral joint too. That can be pain or habits or just moving around on a very small paddock. And the toe angle of the forehooves gets bigger, and being a farrier means to make a decision whether to follow the horse's feet or keep a door open for change towards positive motion patterns. So if you watch a horse like this moving, and you trim the horse's feet the same in a way you see it uses its feet, you close the door for change. Okay. And this happens when the feet got a perfect trim, while rider or trainer ask for negative motion patterns which require an open lumbosacral joint. We will have the positive and negative motion patterns soon. So the horse has feet that don't match the training and the required motion patterns. And that's very difficult, and I think that's the point where many horses become angry. And the horse really needs rider, trainer, farrier, vet and therapist with the same idea of how a horse's body works. Okay, now we will have some nice diagrams. The following slides are made to bring the insights in some order. This visualization helps to understand what happens why and what is caused by what, and it puts your own observations in the right place and into the right correlations. We can put the whole issue into a diagram that shows the interaction between the forces of forehand and hind. The horizontal axis illustrates the propulsion of the hind, and we have 0 in the middle, and yes, on the left we have a negative propulsion. That sounds funny, but it is like this. And this is how I define negative motion patterns. They show sort of negative propulsion. And the vertical axis illustrates the vertical forces in the forehand. Above the horizontal axis you find that forces backward, upwards against the center of mass and the weight of the rider. And below the horizontal axis you have a forward pulling forehand. Yeah, let's have a look at what the horses look like. So in the lower left quadrant we have the horse with a dysfunctional use of the lumbosacral joint with a braking hind and a pulling forehand. And in the upper left quadrant we have a horse with dysfunctional use of the lumbosacral joint with braking hind and correct forehand, and that can happen usually once. I once had a horse that sat on his bum after halt because it did it right in the front and forgot the hind, which did what it always had done, and that was very funny, and it happened only once, but it can happen. In the lower right we have the horse with propulsion and pulling forehand, and that is really unstoppable fun, and that is what most people are afraid of in horses. And this experience, I think, is the reason for the excessive use of methods that need the open lumbosacral joint, because you get an instant control about the propulsion and the speed. And And the upper right contains the horse with propulsion and a functional use of the lumbosacral joint and a strong functional forehand. And this is a horse with maximum self-control and proprioception. And there are only very few horses that are born like this, but nearly every horse can learn that. But it's not the fastest way to control a horse. So in my reality, what I have seen during the last years, we have a big heap of horses with dysfunctional use of the lumbosacral joint, with open lumbosacral joint, with pathologies in hooves, ligaments, muscles, respiration and intestinal tract. And we have a few healthy and rideable horses with a good proprioception and the functional use of the lumbosacral joint and the ground reaction forces. And they are able to rate situations and to react in an appropriate way. They are what I think should be a proper mount. And then we have some horses with overstretched lumbosacral joint, most of them old horses with stiff hocks. But those are few among the horses I see. And what I would like to see is a big amount of healthy and rideable horses with a good proprioception, etc., etc. And you always have some horses with dysfunctional use of the lumbosacral joint, with all the pathologies, but most of them are in the diagram before. Most of these horses were sort of homemade, and you will always have some horses like this, but there shouldn't be so many. And I think the number of the horses with overstretched lumbosacral joint will stay nearly the same. So maybe it was not enough about hooves yet, so Yogi comes next and you will have hooves.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so I think some of that will become more clear as we go through the rest of the talk now. So what I think it's really, really interesting what you were saying about how the shape of the front hooves and hind hooves change as a result of this open lumbosacral joint. And it's very interesting because if we look at the history of what studies have documented the front hooves as versus the hind hooves as, we can see a real change. So if we look at historic studies such as Bauch et al. 1991, they described that the hind foot had a greater angle than the fronts. However, if we look at recent studies, have completely turned that on its head. Now, firstly, as Dyson 2011 stated that low heels are now more common than ideal heels. But further to that, there was Kalka et al. 2020 that showed that the mean dorsal hoof wall angle for hind feet was smaller than the forefeet. And the mean heel angles were also smaller in the hind feet than in the front feet. So we can see that we've had, or perhaps we've had, since 1991 to 2021, we've had a change somewhere, somehow, in forces acting on the feet, and perhaps it's due to more riding or different riding, horses using this open lumbosacral joint. And obviously we would need to do further studies to quantify that, but it's very interesting considering what you were saying. Now, what we need to do to understand what's happening to the hooves and why they're changing shape, and why we see so many hind feet like in these pictures. Now, the reality, of course, is that there are other factors at play when it comes to the shape of the hooves. So we're going to go over those quickly. But then after that, we're going to assume certain things to discuss the forces in play in Maron's hypothesis. So first of all, we know that over a shoeing cycle, the hoof reduces in angle. So this was shown by Van Hill et al. 2005, Molman et al. 2006, and the change was around 3 to 4 degrees over an 8-week shoeing cycle. Now, this also creates increased load on the heels. That's in the front and in the hinds. Now, so obviously, if the Farrey intervention at 8 weeks is not optimal and the hoof isn't returned to correct proportions by the trim, then this angle can deteriorate over a series of cycles, obviously. This will obviously create the hoof conformation we saw in the previous slide. So, yes, poor Farrey can, of course, create low-angled hinds, but we're going to assume in a minute that we're having correct Farrey. So another factor that I've discussed extensively in other webinars is that traditional shoes, open heel shoes, restrict the natural functions of the hoof, often resulting certainly in weaker feet, in failure of the plantar hoof, or as we're just saying, the hinds are lower, then obviously we're going to talk about plantar. So the natural deformation of the hoof is restricted, so meaning it can't disperse the shock it experiences when it's in shoes, leading to it exceeding its elastic capacity and perhaps failing. Also, both the shock dispersion mechanism and the weight counteraction mechanism of the hemodynamic structures is also negated in traditional open heel shoes, resulting very often, again, in weaker feet, in prolapse and increased load. These things can create and exacerbate the hoof conformation that Maron's described in hinds. Now, this is possibly why, regardless of the postural influences, we still have an epidemic of long toe, low heeled conformations, as described by Dyson 2011. But again, we're going to assume that that is not a causing factor. So we're going to look at what happens if that's not a cause. So for the moment, let's assume that it's not poor Farrey and it's not shoes that are creating this long toe, low heel. So what is it that changes the hoof shape with this change in static limb orientation and this change in limb position dynamically, as Maron's just described? So when horses stand like in this position with the camped under position, they completely change the regional loads on the hoof capsule. And of course, we know that form follows function, and also the hoof is a deformable structure between the weight of the horse and is going to succumb to those changes in loads. Now, the hoof also suffers from something called creep, and this is a time-dependent migration of the hoof away from a constant load. So when the horses are constantly standing camped under, so first of all, we're talking about static posture, then those heels are going to be overloaded and taking the load for 22 hours of the day. So if we look at these two pictures here, on the left, we've got, this is a pressure mat reading, if you like, of a foot that is being loaded as normal. And then we've got a foot on the right that is being, or a hind on the right that is being constantly loaded at the heels. And we can see the regional hoof loading changing there. Now, these are my drawings of guesstimated pressure mat readings. But basically, in a camped under hind, we can expect to see what's on the right, and that is excess loading of the heels creating a crushing of the heels and the plantar hoof. And the heels and the back of the foot obviously suffer as a result, and that creates this long toe, low heel conformation that we see in the hind feet. Now, those pressure mat readings were about statics. When we consider the dynamic posture, we start to think about the amount of load each part of the hoof is taking accumulatively during the stance phase. Now, this is something called impulse, and this was studied by a friend of mine, Norman Johnson, studying for his PhD now as well, and he I think was one of the first people to measure impulse. Anyway, so impulse is the accumulative load throughout the whole of the stance phase. So Maren showed us the stance phase was from heel down to toe off. So impulse measures what area of the foot is taking the most amount of load accumulatively throughout that whole stance phase. So what we're going to assume, or what we're assuming here in this talk, and obviously would be a great thing to measure in future studies, is that there is a difference in the impulse acting on the hind with an open versus a closed lumbosacral joint. So what we're saying is that there is more load on the heel over time through the stance phase when they are in that open lumbosacral position. And obviously that increased load leads to that area failing and exceeding its elastic capacity. So if we look at this radiographically, we can also see how the digital cushion, this is a foot with negative plantar angles, see the digital cushion is almost non-existent under the pedal bone, certainly. Now, I think that this constant loading of the digital cushion in this stance, both statically and dynamically, also creates an insidious crushing of the digital cushion. Now, this is something that Dr. Poss also talks about in her studies on the back of the foot. And I've actually seen negative plantar angles in stronger footed horses where their heels haven't crushed, but instead you get just a completely squished digital cushion. So in stronger feet, sometimes we don't actually see the external crushing of the heels, but we do see sometimes that insidious crushing of the digital cushion. Now, what happens is because of this hoof morphology, externally and internally, the necessity for the horse to camp under when they're standing still becomes cemented due to the proprioceptive input that they're then receiving from the feet and also from the mechanoreceptors in the deep digital flexor tendon, which is under increased tension. So what we have now is we have horses that get caught in perpetual cycles, which predisposes them to injury. So I think as an equestrian community, we need to have a think about how domestication, so if people watch those, the webinar with Dr. Gelman, how domestication and perhaps riding style, as Maren has shown, should change perhaps for the sake of the horse's physiology. So what we get with this subject is constant chicken and egg situations. Which comes first, the changes in the hoof shape or the static and dynamic posture? Now, for me, I think we can't ignore static posture, and that is what my studies are kind of majorly focused on. But it's also quite clear that we can't ignore dynamic posture too. Now, interestingly, Maren has discussed here how the way we are affecting the horse's biomechanics is creating this hoof morphology. If we look at Clements et al. 2018 and Pleasant et al. Clements et al. 2019 and Pesnite et al. 2018, they talk about how they suspect that the reason hind limbs have pathology with negative plantar angles referred to higher structures is due to the different job of the hind being propulsive and a change in biomechanics. Also suggesting that the link between the poor hind hoof balance and the higher issues is a result of resultant changes to biomechanics because of the two. Now, if we look at what we've discussed here, what Maren's outlined here, it's quite plausible, I think, that actually the change in biomechanics could possibly come first. Now, Maren and I are going to do a whole different webinar on the ground reaction forces associated with the dynamic posture that she's been talking about. Now, static and dynamic posture are closely linked and influence each other. You can't move correctly if you can't stand correctly, and moving incorrectly will influence how you stand. So the static and dynamic posture that we're talking about here are very closely linked. So this posture that we can see in this picture, I see it so much and it's becoming so common, possibly because it's being created both by the influences on static posture from domestication and then cemented into place by the dynamic postures that Maren's outlined. So that's enough of me. So Maren, it'd be great now if you could kind of talk us through some recognition of this in practice and kind of what we can do about it.
Also, I'm also sure that you can't have a proper dynamic posture that you can't find in the static posture and the other way around. It belongs together. You can't discuss one thing and say the other thing is something different. I think
exactly.
It's not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So, yes, I hope that I could answer some questions the study did arise, and I think we have far more questions to answer. And if we do a webinar about ground reaction forces, we also have to talk about the tensacral structures in the horse, because you can't talk about only one of these things. It would be another interesting topic, but now we will have a look at some horses. Okay, this one is the same horse on the same day and nearly the same minute. On the left with an open lumbosacral joint ready for mischief, and on the right with the lumbosacral joint in neutral closed position and ready to work. And it is the horse's choice how it tries to carry a rider, and it is what the rider demands that makes a big difference. Okay, next. So the other point is manipulation. That is what I often show in live seminars. The same horse in the same minute, on the left with open lumbosacral joint, on the right with lumbosacral joint in neutral closed position. And the horses are allowed to move when I do this, because they have to move, they have to change their position, because with an open, with a functional closed lumbosacral joint, they stand over more ground than with open lumbosacral joint. And on this picture you also see not only the angles of the lumbar spine and the pelvis, you also see that the belly is coming down, and the angle of the cannon bones also changes. And this is also the same horse on the left with passive open lumbosacral joint that's not trained, it's just bored and untrained, just started, and on the right 6 months later with lumbosacral joint in neutral closed position. And this is a matter of training. And of course we have different angles of the pelvis in different breeds. So we have some Icelandic horses with very steep pelvis and functional lumbosacral joint. That is possible, and you always have to check. You can't see it from a picture or from just watching a horse standing around. You have to touch the hind, you have to try to close the lumbosacral joint, and if you can't close it, it obviously is closed already. So don't stick to the pictures, make your own experiences. And here you see the left horse with an open lumbosacral joint, chronically because of it's a training issue, and on the right a horse with lumbosacral joint in neutral closed position. And you see the chestnut comes down very early while the paint rises and rises and rises and rises, and he can even walk in that position, and when you think it can't go further, he will do a jump. And that's what he can do because of his ability to use the hind perfectly, while the chestnut is not able to do that. And you can see that the feet of the chestnut are in another position to the knee, for instance. So you have different points where you can look at. Okay. And this is what is and what could be. That's a nice pony. When we started video coaching, it was the first look at this horse. And I think it is always very important to have an imagination of how this horse could be, and not this is a problem, that is a problem, that is a problem, ooh, and this is ooh. You have to say, okay, it could be like that if it could use its body in another way. And this is a well-known rider, Grand Prix level, in a very high-rated ride on an obviously anti-collected horse. And pictures like these are the reason for the shift to that strange normal, because they succeed with this. They win, and when you can win with a heart like this, I don't know what the competition is for. So you see that the lumbosacral joint is far open, and you see the lumbar spine going downwards, and it hurts from watching. And these riders just press buttons in their horse to do what they have to do in that competition, but there is no... The horse is not able to use its body in a way that is good for the horse and good for the job. And this happens in all the riding styles. I always have to laugh when people from different riding styles tell each other how bad the other riding style is. I see that in nearly all riding styles I know. Maybe there are some I don't know. And it happens everywhere in the world. And it happens when riders use what works instantly. it happens because what we see in the internet every day, that simplifying share pics always win. You see something and it seems obvious that it has to work, and you think that's fine, I will do it like that. And so this simplifying but wrong pictures always win, and it is so hard to find some proper pictures in the internet to show people how it could be, that it's really crazy. Okay, that's it. What you see here is my book translated to English and my website, and depending on your browser, the translation is acceptable when you look at my homepage. And if you have further questions or ideas, you can write an email or contact me on Facebook. So thank you so far for listening. And what I was thinking about, but it didn't belong to that presentation because it's still a thought, is that we need sort of standardized photos, and we have to have a look at how does the horse trot, how does it stand, what's the riding style, and what's the pathologies. That would be a really interesting thing, and I hope to start that next year.
Great. Thank you very much. So, Maren, if you want to turn your camera back on, and I'll turn my camera back on, and then we can go through the questions. So, for me, it's obviously my studies have been focused mainly on static posture. But obviously, as we were saying, static posture and dynamic posture affect each other very much. And for me, it kind of, when I first looked at what you were talking about and listened to you, it really made me realize that our horses don't have much choice, much option, but to stand in this posture, because one, everything about domestication creates this posture, and then we go and ride them also with in a position that also cements the posture in. So it's just amazing to me how everything is pointing towards them not having much of a choice, but that posture just becomes so common. So let's have a look at some of the questions. Maybe Maren, if you want to go through and pick ones that you would like to answer.
I take the first one I have here. I think it's the newest one, but it's about how you can see if the posture is a thing of the breed, that the lumbosacral joint is functionally closed, although the pelvis is steep. And you always have to watch how the force transmission works. And if you review the presentation, you can see the distance on the back of the horse where you can put in 4 or 3 fingers when the lumbosacral joint is open, and you can't do that on a closed lumbosacral joint. And I have seen many Icelandic horses or I'll tell you tomorrow. With a steep pelvis and closed lumbosacral joint, and they have vertical cannon bones. So you look at the pelvis and you think, ooh, bad posture, and you look at the cannon bones and they are vertical.
Wow,
so interesting. That's one sign that it's correct. Or if you see a horse giving full speed with a very steep pelvis and the lumbar spine doesn't go down, so you see there is a force transmission forward, then you are right most of the time that when you say that lumbosacral joint is functionally closed, although the pelvis is steep.
So you would agree with some of the teachings that I've been trying to push, that vertical metatarsals are a very good indication of
Yeah.
of correct posture.
And they are not only a good indication of posture in a standing horse, they are also a good indication in trot. In the middle of the stance phase, in a
Yeah.
normal trot, the cannon bones in the diagonal legs should be vertical at the same time.
Uh-huh. Okay, great. Let's have a look at some more questions. So somebody's asked, so to help a horse with negative plantar angles in the hind hooves, we should assess the whole horse. If trimming shoeing needs to be changed, what factors do you look at before deciding how to trim or shoe? If training needs to change to close the lumbosacral joint. So there's a question to each of us. So there's a question to me about trimming and shoeing, what needs to be changed, what factors do I look at? So for me, I'm very much well, so there's some very, very obvious indicators, certainly when they have negative plantar angles. Most of the time, they've got completely crushed heels, and often those heels are actually lower than the frog, and usually to around the kind of depth of the shoe height, because the back of the foot's actually prolapsed through the heels of the shoe. So the first thing I try to do is to try and re-establish a single plane between the heels and the frog. And actually, Dr. Clements and I have written a paper together on this, on therapeutic shoeing for the hind feet. It would actually be easier for people to read that. It's on my Patreon page, and it's also you can Google it on Google Scholar. But it's basically, it comes down to trying to create the correct proportions of the hoof. So a near straight hoof past an axis, and good proportions around the center rotations. It's the same kind of shoeing really for anything. It's just the ideal of the hoof is the ideal of the hoof for many reasons. And certainly in this case, and the other thing for trimming negative plantar angles is very often you'll find that where the pedal bone has gone backwards in the hoof, you actually get a dip of the corium at the toe. So you do have to be quite careful with how much toe you trim off, because you can get blood quite quick. So you do need to be careful with that. But you have to be brave, because you do need to take as much toe off as you can, but you also need to know where your corium is. And for anything that you can't take from the toe because you're getting close to blood, then you need to work on creating elevation with frog support to create the correct proportions. So then I'll let you answer the second half. If training needs to change to close the lumbosacral joint, what kind of training?
Best thing is to ride out, and if the horse is not able to carry a rider properly, just walk and ride and walk and ride, and do a little bit more in every training, and try to ride uphill, ride changes between different gaits and tempi.
So how do you
The main thing really is the idea of the rider, that the horse has to bring the feet under it to carry a rider. That's simply wrong. It has to use the forces from the hind and has to direct these forces against the rider. And that doesn't work when the feet are under the horse. So you have a different angle, as I have shown in the stick with the stick horses. Different angle of the forces, and I think that's what has to change first. The picture we have of how a horse works.
Mm. So, am I right in thinking that it's more they obviously they have to bring their legs under them to move, but it's the orientation of the limb and where the limb's coming under from. Is that would that be correct?
Mm. What I said about this idea the hind feet have to come under the horse, it usually is too much.
Yeah.
So you have to use the forces from the hind, but you're not supposed to change that triangle the legs work in.
I understand. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's the problem. Because there you can see in the graphics the connection between the
Yeah.
different change in the triangle and the change in the form of the hoof.
Yeah. Perfect. If someone's asked, can you describe the type of manipulation you were doing in the slide where you encouraged it to change its?
It's quite simple. The one to close the lumbosacral joint is about one or 1.5 hands behind the lumbosacral joint on each side of on the croup, where you can scratch a little bit, and if you have a sensitive horse, it will close the lumbosacral joint. And if you try that, be aware the horse has to move. It has to either go back with the hind feet or a little bit forward with the front feet. Don't try that when the horse can't move or when the horse thinks it is not allowed to move.
Okay.
And that other one, I don't do that opening one. I don't like it, but many therapists do this just as a test if the lumbosacral joint works. But many horses are very angry when you do that, so be careful.
Okay. So someone is asking, are you taking into account that the pelvis is most likely out of alignment? I'm an equine.
That the pelvis what?
The pelvis is most likely out of alignment.
Next question.
Okay.
So I don't know what you mean with out of alignment. Do you think it's in a pathological position, or what?
I think. Well, you made it. You mentioned in the talk that the alignment of the pelvis was directly linked to how open or closed the lumbosacral joint was, right?
Yes.
Yes.
The pelvis is always linked to the sacral bone.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe that answers the question. Somebody's mentioned that sometimes chiropractors state that the joint is stuck open. Does the joint get stuck?
Lumbosacral joint.
Yeah, it gets stuck open. Do long backs contribute?
The open lumbosacral joint can be a habit, and if you close it, sometimes the horse looks as if it would collapse in a way, but it is just that what it is used to doesn't work any longer when you close that lumbosacral joint. That's what I said before. It has to change the position of its feet.
Mm.
to stand properly again. And I think when horses have been ridden that way for a very, very long time, or have had pain for a very long time, then happens what always happens in the body if joints don't move any longer and have no use. You get arthritis, or they become bones.
Mm.
Maybe that's what the osteopath said meant when he said it was stuck.
Hang on, let me just find this person. There we go. Okay, so this is an interesting question because, and it's a question that I asked you as well. So I noticed in my study that when I changed the balance of the feet, it changed the limb orientation. So we can kind of assume that it was closing the lumbosacral joint in this context.
But it didn't
Um,
change the bending of the joints in the hind, didn't it?
it didn't
When you
change the hock angle.
Yes,
So hock
because
angle,
because the horse has to stand in another way when you change the form of the hoof.
yeah.
But if you don't show him that it is able to close that lumbosacral joint, it will stand like the hooves demand, but it can't change the angle of the hocks and knees and hip because the lumbosacral joint is still open, and that's a habit or a concept you really have to change in horses.
Okay, that's interesting. So, because in my future studies, I'm going to be measuring, because obviously for my current study, I measured hock angle, metatarsal angle, hoof pastern axis, etc., etc. So in my future studies, because it showed that there was no change in hock angle, which we can therefore assume there was no change in stifle angle because of the reciprocal apparatus, then I am going in my future studies. I'm going to measure pelvic inclination and the lumbosacral joint to see where that change in limb orientation is coming from. So that'll be
I think
interesting to
one 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 problem you have as a farrier is if you want to trim the hooves of horse, you put it on even, flat, and hard ground. And if you want a horse with open lumbosacral joint to change its position, if you close the lumbosacral joint and want it to change the position, you have to do it first on soft ground, in the riding arena, on sand, because only then the horse can change the whole position and can change the position of the hoof on the ground. And you can see what's that angle the horse is standing now, because on sand it can push the sand in a position that it can stand right, what it can't do on hard ground.
yeah. But then if we create the angle that it wanted on the soft ground, which is usually a higher heel, then that is what was creating the in my study anyway was creating the change in limb orientation was um, changing that hoof balance. So hang on, let's have another look.
I could just talk a little bit about kissing spine. It's very fast.
Yeah.
I've just seen this question. Um, that is where biotensegrity comes in. That's not our topic today. But if you work a horse with a functional lumbosacral joint, you could see in the pictures how the spine reacted and expanded when the lumbosacral joint was closed, and I'm quite sure that this will affect the problems of kissing spine. It will not stop any actual inflammations at once, but I think you can prevent kissing spine and can start training a horse to for release.
So that's an interesting question, because obviously all of these joints, when you open and close them, they all affect one another, and there's a knock-on effect. There's a recent study by Dr. Tabor who looked at thoracolumbar angles and how that was linked to kissing spine. So one can assume that there's also a link between the thoracolumbar and lumbosacral. Yes, so absolutely, all these things kind of knock on and have an effect on one another. But I actually saw it in your slides when we went between the open and closed lumbosacral on the Shetty spine. You could actually see how the spinal processes came closer together when it was open. So I thought that was very interesting. So somebody's asking exercises to close the lumbosacral joint. I think you covered that.
I think I can say something, because if you manipulate it, you have no training and you have no therapy. You just have an idea what's the correct position for this horse, and to train it and to get difference in the motion patterns, the horses have to move. So there is lots of training, and it's not there is no collection at first. It's really propulsion and different speeds, different gaits, different grounds to make a change.
Right. So somebody's asking about we have to, somebody's asking, are you basing your answers for the body with the assumption that the entire body is in the best alignment it can be, and that the fascia muscles are actually working correctly? Obviously, when we're discussing these things, we have to make certain assumptions so that we can focus on one thing at a time, because obviously the fascial network is incredibly complex, and there's going to be so many different factors involved. But it's similar to physics, really, where you have an FBD, a free body diagram. You need to kind of focus on one thing at a time. But of course, there's so many different other influences.
But maybe I can show you what happens when the lumbosacral joint opens in a biotensacral structure. If you are
go for it.
That the body works in a tensacral way, then you can see the sacral bone and the rest of the spine as one element under load. Under load means when in the moment of propulsion. And if this connection breaks when the lumbosacral joint opens, you have this little piece. In another presentation, I loaded it up to 5 kilograms. Its own weight is 50 grams, and it's really stable. But I can do. There was one stick made of 2 sticks that were connected and held together by the whole system. And when you disconnect these 2, the whole model has no stability and no power any longer. And that's what's happening when the lumbosacral joint opens under load. The whole structure doesn't have that strength, and it collapses. And that's what makes kissing spines, crushed heels, and all that.
Yeah, so everything is connected, absolutely. Okay, great. I think that will do for today. Thank you so much, Maren. I'm looking forward to doing some more on the ground reaction forces and stuff. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. There will be a recording for anyone who missed bits. And thank you all very much. And if you want more information on all these kind of things, please have a look up of Maren's book. I've got it. I've started reading it. It's great. So I can definitely encourage you guys to have a read of that. Thank you very much, everyone, and I will see you all soon.
And thanks for the invitation, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.